Hello, my name is Kal Molinet from Richmond, Virginia, and I'm an anarchist.
I'm Matt Battaglioli. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and I am also an anarchist.
And today we bring to you the news from Underground. This time covering a story that we found on Salon, in which Why You're Wrong About Communism, 7 Huge Misconceptions About It and Capitalism, written by Jesse Meyerson. So this is going to be an interesting piece that we're going to kind of take apart and critique and show you all the different numerous ways and how this person even shows more further information about, I guess, communism, democracy, socialism, capitalism.
The format of the article, by the way, is there's just 7 points and they're all bullet pointed, and then we're just going to go down those and pick out something about each one of them and talk about it a little bit.
Yeah. But I guess, before we kind of continue with this, it's best to kind of first define some of these terms and terminology. So how would you define capitalism?
Well, I use the word capitalism and free market somewhat synonymously, which is mostly a 20th century and beyond thing. 19th century philosophers, economists would not do that, but now that we have subjective value, we do. So I would just say a system in which the means of production are privately owned, property is respected to its most extensive criteria, and that basically you can make the contracts that you want to make and not the ones you don't want to make.
Yeah. So essentially respect for private property and voluntary exchanges. And not so much in terms with communism. They have a lot of listed points on what communism entails. A lot of them as abolition of the family, almost there. You have complete control of transportation, monopoly on roads. You have communication systems, USPS. You have
Fed.
Yeah, the Fed. They want to have a centralized state bank currency. That's the Fed. They want to have free schools for children. You have your public indoctrination camps.
Free,
right. Of course, and they also advocate for the abolition of property ownership and land ownership. And there's also taxes in communism, believe it or not. So they call it a graduated income tax. So not that far different from what kind of exists today in the name of democracy. So when you look at countries, what you're looking at is, I guess, a balance between capitalism and socialism. Today we don't have a capitalist system. It's not a capitalist economy. It's a free market. No, it's a state-controlled economy. It's a state-controlled market. There's some pieces of capitalism in some respect, but that's in the individual aspect of it. Government in itself doesn't respect private property. You look at eminent domain as an example of that. You look at the war on drugs as an example in which they don't even have respect for you as owning your own body. So before we kind of continue these points, it's kind of important to kind of understand that we don't live in a capitalistic society. We live in a state-controlled society, a mafia-controlled, sociopathic-controlled society, under which it's the gun pointed at everyone else that makes the rules. So yeah, we're going to go enumerate down the list, and so stay with us. So the first point: only communist economics rely on state violence. In capitalism, competing ownership claims are settled by the state's willingness to use violence to exclude all but one claimant. If I lay claim to one of David Cush's mansions, libertarian that he is, he's going to rely on big government and its guns to set me right. He owns that mansion because the state says he does and threatens to imprison anyone who disagrees. Where there isn't a state, whoever has the most violent power determines who gets the stuff. Be that a warlord, a knight, the mafia, or a gang of cowboys in the Wild West. Either by vigilantes or the state, property rights rely on violence. First off, especially when we're going to make an example saying, well, these are going to revert back to the Wild Wild West. Like, the Wild West was not that wild. That's a lot of Hollywood propaganda myths that's been circulated for quite some time. Actually, you'll find like most deaths were kind of like 1 or 2 a town per year max. It wasn't as violent and crazy as people have seen. Because if you kill a store clerk owner who has all the contacts and networks and who has amassed that kind of, I guess, system on his own, good luck finding another barber. Good luck finding a store clerk. Good luck finding a saloon owner in the middle of nowhere. These people provide very valuable assets, very valuable commodities for these people who kind of value them as such.
And Cal, is this your tablet?
Yes, it's my tablet.
Who are you? This tablet, by the way. Yeah. Who are you aggressing against to own it?
Right? Yeah. I'm constantly in aggression with everyone here. My neighbors, you. Yeah.
You can at any time you can test the legitimacy of any claim. I mean, if the argument is, well, there is violence being used to maintain this property, go and find a single person who will say that they are being violently aggressed against for the sake of somebody maintaining ownership of their tablet. or even their house, or even their beach house they aren't actually living in at the time.
Right.
You know, nobody actually is going to say that. Oh yes, I'm being aggressed against. So that's completely legitimate. You know?
Right. There's no factual evidence to show that I've ever used violence to obtain any of these materials on my property. I'm not using violence to claim self-ownership of my body. Right, and of course, when you look at a lot of the words that a lot of these Marxists use, socialists, all alike, they're very vague, and they like to encompass everything as violence. They like to say all property is violence, and they find it difficult to kind of press and to give you a real definition that can kind of preclude and exclude areas that what is not violence, right? So I like to define violence as placing a person in an involuntary position without their consent or choice, right? I.e., all violations of self-ownership, all violations of property rights, murder, rape, theft, assault, right? This is the initiation of aggression, initiation of that force. When they're talking about me owning my tablet, that it's protected by violence, is not. Yes, if someone were to take it without my consent and choice, I will act accordingly in defense as I would anyone who lays a hand on me without my consent or choice. Right? I'm acting in self-defense from that initiation.
So, I mean, if your argument is that maintaining property relies on violence, then I guess so you're aggressing violently against people to stay alive.
Right. Yeah.
That's by extension. That's legitimately true. Right.
It's the self-defense aspect of it. You're not initiating it; they are initiating. You're enacting as a resistant from that initiation of force, and that's not violence. That's resistance. That's protection. Yeah. So you always kind of want to point these things out when you're talking to these communists, to these socialists. They like to make things very vague, like in zeitgeist, structural violence and all this stuff. And so, but we can probably go over that another time. Structural violence. But yeah, so the thing with government, so they'll say that government makes these kinds. Again, in the Wild West, they had a lot of agencies that had accordance places where you can kind of make your claim on these lands, and there's all voluntary, there's all consensual, and there's a lot of different places that people have had access to these stations to do this for. So the state at the time was not the only agency there. Actually, they try to make every effort to kick out the state every time they try to encroach into those territories. But of course, the monopoly on violence that the government has, all the guns and the military and the trained sociopaths eventually overcame and took over the Wild West area. Right. So the next point.
Yeah, next, our number 2. Capitalist economies are based on free exchange, so they're arguing this is a myth. Okay. The explanation. The origin of capitalism was depriving British peasants of their access to land, or seizure of property, you might call it, and therefore their means of subsistence, making them dependent on the market for their survival. Once propertyless, they are forced to flock to the dreck, drink, and disease of slum-ridden cities and sell the only thing they had, their capacity to use their brains and muscles to work or die. Just like them, the vast majority of people today are deprived of access to the resources we need to flourish, though they exist in abundant quantities, so as to force us to work for a boss who is trying to get rich by paying us less and working us harder. First point I want to make is at the end of that. Yes, it's true, all bosses, managers, business owners, whatever, always want to pay the least for the most. But at the same time, the employee who's agreeing to that contract wants to work the least and get paid the most.
Exactly, yeah. So, otherwise that transaction, that value exchange wouldn't come.
Right.
Wouldn't arise.
Right.
So, and also managers and business owners are also consumers. So they like to sometimes separate that you're consumers and they're the producer. What are they going to do with their money? They have to consume it somehow as well.
That's right. So, but in any time an agreement happens, there's a net gain.
Yeah.
Because everyone perceives that they are benefiting from it.
Right. Value exchange for value.
Next, in the beginning of this, I'll say again, the origin of capitalism was depriving British citizens of their access to land or seizure of property. What it does not say is who was doing it.
Right.
And that's going to go to our main point here, which is, of course, the underlying factor, which is, of course, the state.
Right. Yeah. And of course, a lot of this stuff, maybe we'll do a covering of the Industrial Revolution. There's a lot of myths that come from there to try to blame capitalism again, but you can find many examples, factual evidence to show actually it was always state intervenience that caused a lot of these conditions to be worsened. Like you have one, for example, of Windows.
Oh, yeah. So during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, what you had was people would perceive the income tax as what it actually is, which is an invasion of your personal privacy and an abduction of property. So that was not politically profitable at all. So in an attempt to tax people based on their income, the governments at the time would make an assumption, well, if you're richer, you have bigger houses or bigger buildings or bigger factories or whatever, and then they would tax them in accordance to how many windows they had. So all that really did was create a huge disincentive for business owners and factory runners to make their working environments for their employees more comfortable or more livable. So of course you have all of this very, very commonly recited hymns, which is the factories from the 1800s during the Industrial Revolution were very impossible to work in. The conditions were horrible and it was stuffy and disgusting. But the reason for that is not because business owners are just greedy. There's a big incentive the businesses have to keep their working environments comfortable, and that is because their employees are naturally going to be more productive in those environments versus the ones that they were actually in. But that was actually countered by the disincentive created by the government through the window tax.
Right.
Yeah.
The more windows you have, the more taxes you have to pay.
Yeah. So what are you going to do in that situation? Of course.
Right. So point number 3, communism killed 110 million people for resisting disposition. And this is interesting. This is trying to appeal to emotions. Or, for example, for one thing, a large number of the people killed under the Soviet communism weren't the kulaks. Everyone pretends to care about themselves, communists. Stalin and his paranoid cruelty not only had Russian revolution leaders assassinated and executed, but indeed exterminated entire communist parties. These parties weren't interested in having their property collectivized. They were committed to collectivizing property. It's also worth remembering that the Soviets had to fight a revolutionary war against, amongst other, the U.S., which, as the American Revolution is enough to show, doesn't mainly consist of group hugs. They also faced and heroically defeated the Nazis, who were not an ocean away, but right on their doorstep. So this is an attempt to say, well, communists who advocated for communists were okay with it because they were also for advocating for collectivization of property. So we should kind of discount those stats to begin with, instead of looking at them actually as individuals and as people. And you can find that they were then betrayed by that ideology. Right?
Yeah, so Leon Trotsky was a communist, but he was still a person. So this idea that saying that it's a misconception that it killed 110 million people, give or take, that's not a misconception just because the people that were killed largely were communists themselves.
Right. So, well, there are communists, so you can kind of discount them and say, well, the numbers are a lot smaller than that. Well, we look at the point of view that regardless of what you want to call your sociopathic dictatorship government, the United States itself has murdered over 20 million people since the end of World War II. So you can count the number of escalating deaths, also 1.5 Iraqis. That's what happens with statism. That's what happens with any kind of government. So, I mean, the individual's correct in pointing out the United States has also murdered. Yeah, but in the way that he's trying to kind of sugarcoat the number of deaths under communism, tens of millions have died under Mao, the Great Famine, for example. Same thing with Stalin, same thing with Hitler. And you'll find every single government out there that continues to have a long history of cruelty disposing their own, civilian population.
In the case of the United States, now there can be such a thing as certain parts of the country, the economists can be socialist versus capitalist. The military is completely socialist. Yeah. So that's what's killing people. It's not,
right. Those are not free market soldiers. Yeah. Those are not respect your property rights soldiers. Those are sociopathic, under the control of these socialistic countries soldiers. So that's, for all the evidence out there, I mean, it was a socialist country, the United States, that nuked two cities. Right? That's not capitalism. That's not the free market. That's statism. And so the next point that we have here is capitalist governments don't commit human rights atrocities. Whatever one's assessment of the crimes committed by communist leaders, it is unwise for capitalism's cheerleaders to play the body count game, because if people like me have to account for the Gulag and the Gray Sparrow campaign, they'll also have to account for the slave trade, the indigenous extermination, the late Victorian Holocaust, and every war, genocide, and massacre carried out by the U.S. and its proxies in order to defeat communism. Since the pro-capitalist sets cares so deeply for the suffering of the Russian and Chinese masses, perhaps they'll even want to account for the millions of deaths resulting for this country transitions to capitalism. And as we pointed out, yeah, we do count. That wouldn't say that's capitalism. Again, we already provided a good objective definition of capitalism. That's just a state-controlled market. It also goes on, let them try to convince the tens of million people who die of malnutrition every year because of the free market is incapable of engineering a situation in which less than half of the world's food is thrown away.
Okay, guys, really?
Yeah.
Come on.
I would imagine the many deaths that have been prevented due to starvation is due to at least some portion of capitalism, at least some respect for property rights and means of ownership of that kind of property rights to kind of produce mass abundance of food for everyone's consumption at the most capacity allowable. You look at in India with this green revolution, you look at buying cheap food today at your local grocery market, which could be
Yeah, if you were to work $5 an hour, 1 hour a day, you could eat.
Yeah.
You'd have enough calories to sustain your life, which is unheard of. I mean, these more socialist-leaning countries really couldn't even get food together for everybody that would, sustain life.
Yeah.
That's why you have the Great Famine. That's why you have,
Yeah, look, Mises has a quote here. It says, "Capitalism is essentially a system of mass production for the satisfaction of the needs of the masses. It pours a horn of plenty upon the common man. It has raised the average standard of living to a height never dreamed of in earlier ages. It has made accessible to millions of people enjoyments which a few generations ago were only within the reach of a small elite." So you find a lot of people today, especially those in poverty here in the United States, that they have access to vehicles, they have access to microwaves, refrigerations, cell phones.
And Mises died, by the way, at 92 years old, 1973.
Oh, right. Yeah.
In fact, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the spread of more free market economies around the world, global poverty has declined rapidly. Certainly no thanks to any of the efforts made by the UN, which couldn't even make it a country like Mauritania to make slavery illegal until 2007.
Right. So you want to look at socialism at work, you look at the long bright lines right now in Venezuela, right?
Yeah.
You want to look at some of the again, we don't have a capitalistic market here, but some aspect of it that does remain, look at that abundance of choice when you go to a supermarket and the low cost of fruits and bananas. And
a little capitalism goes a long way.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be completely capitalist to sustain people's lives.
Right.
Yeah.
And the next point.
Just 1 second, Cal. I want to make sure there was something else in this one that I wanted to. I think I wanted to hit. I think you might have mentioned that in the beginning. I just wanted to point out that the part of the United States government, I would say capitalist government, as is in the title, capitalist governments don't commit human rights atrocities. Capitalist government's almost an oxymoron.
Yeah. It is there's no such thing. Like, for example, when you look into, if you study economics or have any of these textbooks at your local colleges, and they'll try to say, well, this is a free market policy. No, there's nothing free market about it. It's always state controlled. A free market is completely free. You have completely free voluntary exchanges. There's no extortion. There's no taxes, no imports, no tariffs. There's no stranger middleman dressed as a bureaucrat trying to get in the middle of that exchange and threatening you because you're not giving up a portion of your profits to them. That's government. That's the state-controlled market.
Right.
So the 21st century.
21st century, the misconception they're citing, 21st century American communism would resemble 20th century Soviet and Chinese horrors. He goes on to say, for me, communism is an aspiration, not an immediately achievable state. It, like democracy and libertarianism, is utopian in that it constantly strives towards an ideal. In its case, the non-ownership of everything, the treatment of everything, including culture, people's time, and the very act of caring and so forth, as dignified and inherently valuable rather than as commodities that can be priced for exchange. Steps towards the state of affairs needn't include anything as scary as the wholesale and immediate abolition of markets. After all, markets predate capitalism by several millennia, and communists love a good farmer's market. Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we ascribe for utopia.
I don't.
Yeah, I haven't met any libertarians or anarcho-capitalists that advocate for utopian. We want problems that can be solved non-violently, of course.
I want someone to make a better computer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I want an upgrade. I want a new, better version. What's point 2 going to look like?
Yeah.
Utopia means we're done. It's over. We already have all the complete policies. So we have everything's perfect, right? And I don't want everything to be perfect. I want there to be ways to always continue to improve and ways to kind of solve these problems without the state intervention of a gun. And that's what communism entails. Of course, they still advocate for income tax, right? So they still advocate for a lot of the same, policies that today's socialists advocate for here in the United States of tax forms. So you find that to be, I don't know. I find that to be kind of a misconception or kind of a distraction. When he talks about as dignified and inherently valuable, value is still subjective. These trying to place an inherent value. It's not something that it goes against value. Subjective. The value is subjective. It goes against that. It's not. No commodity has an inherent value.
Right. If everyone stops smoking and nothing else changed, tobacco will be worthless tomorrow.
Right.
That's what he talks here about. about treatment of everything, including culture, people's time, the very act of caring, and so forth, as dignified and inherently valuable, rather than as commodities can be priced for exchange. And then he talks about how they'd all love a good farmer's market. Well,
Right.
that farm is going to dry up and die because you'd have, without any reasonable market prices that are determined only decentrally, which doesn't exist in communism or socialism, then those prices don't reflect the actual supply and demand, the marginal utility, the scarcity of each thing. So if the centralized planning board says, well, the price of whatever crop is 80 cents, but it turns out to be $1, well, that's going to be overpicked. The farm would be collectivized, by the way, so no one's going to be able to reap profits from that farm. So they're not going to bother with tilling the land or watering the crops or any of that stuff, because they're not going to get any benefit from that that they can perceive, and then whatever good is there already will be immediately picked over, and that's called the tragedy of the commons.
They can't pursue their self-interest.
Right, and people are naturally selfish.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that at all.
That I care about other people. First person you should care about first. It's yourself. Sustain your own needs before you can kind of reach out to help others.
Is it reasonable in any way to expect a person to routinely make a decision that puts them in a worse situation tomorrow than they were in today?
Right. And that's all about the individual, which is the last point that we'll cover in a second.
Number point 6 and 7. You want to hit 6?
Yeah. So communism fosters uniformity, but people do a lot more than consume. One thing we do a huge amount of is work, or for the millions of unemployed Americans, try to and are not allowed. Communism envisages a time beyond work when people are free. As Marx wrote, to do one thing, this lazy guy, to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. And that way, communism is based on the total opposite of ununiformity, tremendous diversity, not just among people, but even within a single person's occupation. And of course, if you want to talk about unemployed Americans, you could look at the national centralized banking system that communism advocates for, like the Fed, that depreciates the currency. That causes unemployment. That causes a lot of people to find within their small budget to begin with to save, to build up, capital to kind of escape that kind of poverty. You find a lot of government intervention that prevents a lot of people from escaping those tragedies, like permits and licenses that restrict support from competing, government lobbying policies that allows higher businesses to discriminate and outcompete lower ones. So all this stuff is a system, is a sick, festering disease from statism that's causing a lot of impoverished Americans. It causes a lot of this, unemployed, as they would call it.
Yeah, and under a capitalist system, let's say, I'm not going to call this a completely free market, but it's comparatively a free market. You'll have a full-time worker about 40 hours a week. That's less than half the week. So so I go to work. I work part-time. I work about 20 hours a week, and I sell musical instruments. And I can do that, and then I can come here and I can make these videos, and I can work on my albums, and I can do all these things that I really like to do, because we mentioned earlier, for the less than the price of what one person will make every hour, I can feed myself for the day if I want to. I mean, sometimes I like better food, but I'm saying I don't have to worry about my survival because the food's so abundant here, because people have an incentive to actually produce and to market their products. I don't have to worry about those things. I don't have to work as hard, so I have some leisure time. I have some time to do different things. So that this idea that that communism doesn't foster uniformity and capitalism will, as they're going to point out in the 7th topic, which I'm going to hit in just a second, is completely ridiculous, because it is the fact that I don't have to work so many hours doing the same thing over and over again that makes it so that I can have different interests and enjoy different aspects of life that I wouldn't.
That's why you're not a farmer.
That's why I'm not a farmer. Before the 1900s, it was less than 1% of people were not farming to make money.
Yeah.
But those people found better jobs eventually, and so did phone operators. And eventually, if robot's going to take my job, and I'll have to find a better job.
Yeah. That pushes you out to find and explore different areas.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't have to do crappy work like go work on a farm for 16 hours a day.
Right.
I can go work in a completely air-conditioned building selling instruments for 6 hours a day, and be able to have a higher standard of living, and then go do other things for the rest of my time. Now, it is true that sometimes the division of labor does have a person for this time while they're at work doing one pretty monotonous task, but to the extent in which that's all they'll do for their whole life, that's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I guess point number 7, sort of recapping that a little bit.
Right. Well, in terms of individuality, I would say, a free market kind of caters to that because there's a niche market for anything imaginable out there, and there's a market for anything you can imagine or think about. You look at niches and markets for toys, niches and markets for movies. A lot of the stuff that prevents the individuality, that strangles and suffocates, that is intellectual property. So intellectual property in itself is what kind of prevents a lot of this, I guess, unique creativity to come out and to be as prosperous and as abundant. So of course the author here is making the statement that capitalism restricts that. No, it's called the state-controlled market that restricts that. It's the monopoly on patents, on trademarks, on copyrights, on patents that are preventing this rich abundance of other new materials and new abundance of, I guess, not the stale commercialized versions that you see today that prevents competition from, I guess, small competition. Again, that's lobbying for state control. Lobbying for politics.
Right.
It's government itself that gets in the way, not these businesses. Without government, there's no one to bribe, there's no one to lobby, there's no one to enforce those guns onto other people.
You got to put up or shut up.
Yeah, pretty much like the fashion industry. They compete, try to compete each other like every week, and they don't have copyrights on the patterns and dress styles that they showcase. But like every week, new forms of stylists comes out all the time. So that's what you'll have. You'll have like a lot of different versions of, I guess, movies that will come out, that kind of restricts it because of copyright issues. You have a lot of different books, a lot of different characters, a lot of fanfic will come out. I mean, you look at Tesla again, releasing all the patents because they want to see a huge market competition of electric vehicles. All right, so at least they're ahead of the game, and they understand, I guess, the tragedy that comes with that, and they see the incentive in that kind of competition.
It's like when restaurants sing the Happy Birthday song to somebody, they have to all have their own version because they won't have to pay a royalty or anything.
Right? Yeah. You can't use your own vocal cords and produce vibrations in the air. So you're not robbing anyone of any property, and then that sounds more. It is socialistic.
Yeah, extremely.
Yeah, and kind of matches this communist ideal as well. So with that, save capitalism, liberate the free market, and end this socialist nightmare. I'm Kal Molinet.
Battaglioli.
See you guys at Victory Party. Take good care.